Hi people! A while ago I took a look at how long Phase 4, 5 and 6 should be. I did this by comparing previous phase lengths in Classic with patch lengths in Vanilla. This time I'll be taking a look at how much health the bosses in AQ will likely have, and I'll do this by comparing health values from Vanilla to health values in Classic. When it comes to health values for bosses in Classic, Molten Core and BWL, I simply looked at my guild's logs. First off, we will compare the values for Molten Core and BWL to see whether the values in Classic have been adjusted to some degree compared to Vanilla, and how much if that is the case. For values from Vanilla, I looked at values from WoWWikifandom.com and also at values from the private server Nostalrius and the daughter servers of that. The reasons why I decided to look at values from the private servers are the following. In part, it will give a sense of what the difficulty is going to be like. You could basically look at the footage and go, it's going to be easier than this, or possibly harder. It's also partly because I believe that when people claim things like Ahn'Qiraj will be way harder than BWL, and you must bring a flask, what they really mean is probably something like this. On Nostalrius, Ahn'Qiraj was much harder than BWL, and we needed flasks. So I'm basically using Nostalrius and its daughter servers as something to compare and refer to. Now, if Classic Ahn'Qiraj is tuned roughly the same way as Nostalrius type Ahn'Qiraj was, then we're likely going to be needing flasks. But as you will see, that is probably not going to be the case. I initially thought that the values from private servers were going to be higher than those of Classic, as I remember the private server raids being way harder than the Classic raids are. But the truth turned out to be a little bit more complicated than that. We're now gonna go through the values of Molten Core and BWL on Classic, WoWWikifandom page and the Nostalrius type servers and compare them. We're then gonna use these comparisons to try and predict the values in Ahn'Qiraj. So let's start off and look at Molten Core. Oh, and by the way, when I say in Vanilla, I'm referring to values taken from the WoWWikifandom page. So, in Vanilla, Lucifron had roughly 352,000 health, and this is also true for the Nostalrius servers. In Classic, he has 351,000. Vanilla Magmadar sits at 826,000 health, which he also sat at on the Nostalrius servers. In Classic, Maggie has 826,000 health. Gehennas, Gar and Baron Geddon are also equal among the three sources. Gehennas has 351,000 health, Gar 651 and Geddon 356. For Shazra, there is a very minor difference. In Classic, Shazra is at 351,000 and the vanilla values say around 350k. I think you've gotten the idea now. The health values in Molten Core are equal among the three sources. Moving on to BWL, we start noticing some differences. They are, however, quite small. So Razorgore had the same in Vanilla as he has in Classic. Valistraz is actually different. On Nostalrius, he had 1.137 million health at 30%, which is where the fight starts. In Classic, he has 1 million flat at 30%. Broodlord has a small difference of 6,000 health, sitting at 910k in Vanilla and on Nostalrius, and 916k in Classic. For all the coming three dragons, Firemaw, Ebonrock and Flamegore, they all sit at 1 million health in Classic. Meanwhile, the latter two differ in Vanilla. Ebonrock sat at 940k and Flamerock at 990. Vanilla Chromagus sat at 1.8 million, meanwhile Classic has 1.83 million. Finally, Necerium on Nostalrius had 2.083 million health, meanwhile the Classic counterpart had 2.165 million. For some reason there was no health value of Necerium on the WoWWiki webpage. The point of all these comparisons was to show you how similar the numbers are. I am therefore confident to assume that the numbers in classic Ahn'Qiraj and maybe even Necerium will be the same as their vanilla counterparts. Although the values from Necerium are very close to the classic values, the WoW wiki values are actually just a little bit more accurate. The differences are still very small. But do note that these are only the health values. They're not the damage values, armor values, resistances, or anything like that. It is not impossible that all of those values are different, and therefore the fights would be at a different difficulty, despite the fact that the bosses have the same health now as they did long ago. Just as I was starting to write down the values for Ahn'Qiraj in this text document, I realized something interesting. As I mentioned earlier, I took some values from the Necerium type servers, and I got the values by watching a raid where the players were using an add-on to show boss health. But I also looked at the values stated on WoW Wiki fandom, and for Ahn'Qiraj, the values on Necerium and the values on WoW Wiki are very different. For Necerium the Prophet, WoW Wiki states 467,000 health, but on Necerium he had 605,000 health. That is a big difference, and this trend seems to continue throughout Ahn'Qiraj. For the bug trio, WoW Wiki gave these values: Lord Chris at 226,500, Princess Zhao at 300k, and Vem at 433. Necerium had these values: Lord Kree at 351, Princess Zhao at 388, and Vem at 516k. WoW Wiki states that Battleguard Sertra had 750,000 health, meanwhile Nost had him at 967,000. Frankris the Unyielding has 993k health according to Wiki, and he had 1.3 million on Necerium. Uru, 2 million on Wiki, and 2.2 million on Necerium. Princess Huhuron, 993k versus 1.3 million. The Twin Emperors. Here we actually have an exception. On Necerium, both were at 642k. Meanwhile, according to WoW Wiki, the Warrior one, Vecnilash, sits on 2.16 million, and Veclor the Mage one sits on 1.04 million. There might be something I don't know about this fight, but here the health values seem the other way around. Anyway, moving on. Necerium Cthulhu had 1.3 million health during Phase 1 and 1 million on Phase 2. According to WoW Wiki, he had 955k. I suppose that is referring to Phase 1 Cthulhu. As for Viscidius, the fight is quite different, as you need to freeze and shatter the boss, not DPS him down to 0. Therefore, comparing health values really doesn't make much sense, which is why I will leave the health values out of this boss. On Necerium, Ahn'Qiraj seems to have been tuned about 30% higher compared to what the WoW Wiki states, at least for all bosses except the Twin Emperors and the Bug Trio. On the Twin Emperors, the WoW Wiki values seem way higher, but there is probably some mechanic that makes that fight special, and so I won't compare that one. For the Bug Trio, the values are rather 50% higher on Necerium. My personal belief is that when players are claiming things about the difficulty of coming raids, a lot of them are thinking about the tuning of the Necerium private servers and how hard the raids were there. I believe that to be the reason why most players consider Ahn'Qiraj a huge step up in difficulty compared to BWL, because on the Necerium private server, it absolutely was a huge step up. Not only was it the next big raid tier, it was also tuned 30% higher. Therefore, I don't believe the private server meta will hold. I don't believe you will need flasks in Ahn'Qiraj. Sure, it will help you, just as it helps in BWL, but I don't think it's gonna be a case of just barely making it over the finishing line with 30 dead people after a perfectly executed fight if you are going flaskless. Now it might take you a reset or two to gain enough experience and gear to bring down Cthulhu, but that's hardly the same thing as needing flasks for every Ahn'Qiraj raid. And although world buffs, flasks and consumables are really strong, they won't usually do much good if people aren't focused and paying attention to begin with. On Nostalrius, people needed to be well geared, pay attention, play well and bring all their buffs and flasks, because Ahn'Qiraj was tuned really high. Supposing Classic will follow the WoW wiki numbers, which is what they will most likely do, the requirements won't be that high. So anyway, to give you a summary, these are the numbers I predict in Ahn'Qiraj. Scaram the Prophet at 467,000 health. For the Bug Trio, Kree at 226k, Yao at 300k and Vem at 433k. Sarchera at 750k. Frankris at 1 million. Uru at 2 million. Huhuran 1 million. The Twins 1 million and 2 million. Cthulhu 1 million in Phase 1 and 700,000 in Phase 2. For Visitors, well, it doesn't really matter. To give a conclusion of the difficulty, I believe it will be roughly the same step up as we had between Molten Core and BWL. Now, the Black Lotus crash happened a short time after the script was finished, so I'll add a comment about that here. Depending on how low the Lotuses drop, people might start to flask out of convenience and not out of necessity. However, I still believe that flasks won't be required in order to have a somewhat smooth Ahn'Qiraj raid. That was all from me for this time. I hope you found it interesting. Make sure to leave a like if you did and perhaps subscribe for more videos in the future. I stream over at twitch.tv/NeceriumClouds. Feel free to come over and say hi. The stream is the best way to reach me if you have any questions or whatever it might be. Anyways, that was all I had for now. I'll be back with another video soon. Until then, see ya!